Good evening. It is so good to see all of you here. I am Madhu Bakinola, a professor here at the business school and the director of the Bernstein Center for Leadership and Ethics. And I just want to welcome you to the annual KPMG Pete Marwick Stanley R. Klion Forum, featuring a panel discussion on generative AI, a topic that we all want to hear more about, learn more about, are using in our own subtle ways. And what is this thing called the Klion Forum? Well, since 1993, it's been one of the premier speaker series here at CBS, and we feature prominent leaders from various industries. And the goal is to have leaders who are focused on resolving major ethical, social, political, economic challenges of our time. And, just even saying the word challenges of our time, it's important to just acknowledge that we are in a rough time right now in this world, and where there's a lot of pain. And so I just wanted to make sure that many of our community members who are directly and indirectly affected know that we are holding everyone in our hearts. And it's good to see everyone here tonight to come out and learn more. So I want to especially start by thanking the Klion family, because they've been dedicated to bringing issues facing current and future business leaders to the forefront of conversations at CBS. And this forum was founded in memory of Stanley R. Klion. He was a prominent executive in residence here at CBS from 1986 to 1994. And he was an executive vice chairman and chief operating officer at Pete Marwick International, which was and is one of the firm's largest accounting and management consulting firms. And even though he is now no longer with us, the Bernstein Center is really privileged to have committed support from the Klion family. So thank you to the Klion family for all you do to allow these important topics to be at the forefront of our agenda. So I am excited to introduce our panel, and most important, to introduce our moderator, Professor Daniel Guetta. And we're so lucky to have him lead us here today. He always brings such energy. He is one of the teachers in a program that I run for executives, and he is always the highlight of the session. He is an associate professor of professional practice here at CBS, and he directs several of the school's centers and initiatives, including the Center for Pricing and Revenue Management and the Business Analytics Initiative. And I know many of your students are in the audience here. And his research focuses on the ways companies can harness the power of data and analytics to drive value. Before Columbia, he was a data scientist and engagement manager at Palantir Technologies, and he's worked with clients around the world to help them solve their hardest problems using data. And he did his undergrad studies in physics and mathematics at Cambridge and at MIT. And he received his PhD in operations research right here at CBS. So he is one of our own. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. And I will pass it off to you, Professor Guetta.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to moderate this forum. Thank you all for being here. Very, very excited about this conversation. So much to discuss, so little time, so let's jump straight into it. I want to introduce each of our panelists one by one. I'll read you a little bit about them, and then I'm going to ask each of you to perhaps tell me a little bit about your connection to AI, how you came to be interested in the field, how long you've been interested in the field, and sort of some of the work you've done. And then I guess after that, we'll kick off our discussion. Let me begin to my left with Talia Gillis, who studies the law and economics of consumer markets. She's interested in household financial behavior and how consumer welfare is shaped by technological and legal changes. Some of her recent work considers how artificial intelligence and consumer fintech more broadly is affecting consumers and raises distributional concerns. Her paper, The Input Fallacy, was the winner of the 2022 AALS Scholarly Papers Competition. She's a recipient of the 2022 Junior Faculty Grant and the Richard Paul Richmond Center for Business, Law and Public Policy Grant. She joined the Columbia faculty in 2020 after completing an SJD at Harvard and pursuing a PhD in economics at Harvard. and she was John M. Olin Fellow in Empirical Law and Finance, a Terence M. Considine Fellow in Law and Economics, and a Program on Negotiations Fellow. She clerked for Deputy Chief Justice Hanan Meltzer of the Supreme Court of Israel. Thank you so much for being here with us, and let me hand it over to you and ask you where your interest in AI lies.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it kind of started very much as a PhD student in economics. It's kind of interesting when you think sometimes AI and machine learning is sometimes a little bit in tension with some of our classic economics tools and in econometrics. And at the time in the economics department, there was a real kind of soul searching of thinking through, well, how is this different? What can AI, what kind of tools and what kind of abilities can AI give us that perhaps kind of exist outside the typical realm of empirical research? So I think that was very influential. And if you look at econ departments today, they're very much the background of the students. A lot of them come in with kind of machine learning and computer science background. And I think the other element of what got me kind of excited in thinking about AI was the side of regulation of AI, particularly when it came to financial regulation and consumer finance. Consumer finance, particularly consumer credit, was one of those domains in which AI was adopted fairly early. There's a lot of kind of quite clear prediction problems that happen in consumer finance. And so noticing these differences in terms of kind of what data was being used to predict people's creditworthiness and discussions about the impact that would have, and kind of even more importantly, how do we regulate this domain of consumer credit? There's so many areas which we'll talk about today that kind of generative AI has kind of raised issues around regulation in kind of domains in which we've never thought about regulation. Consumer finance really isn't one of those domains. Consumer finance is a heavily regulated domain, and yet we're kind of left with all these open questions of how do we apply the kind of existing framework, the existing law to this completely new technology and the new questions.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Next up, I'm very pleased to introduce Jahao Chen, who is an independent consultant focusing on global AI governance and risk management. His company, Responsible AI LLC, has diverse clients ranging from sovereign wealth funds, startups, enterprises, nonprofits, and government agencies. He builds enterprise-ready solutions for developing and deploying responsible AI systems in highly regulated industries, taking appropriate global perspectives in AI regulation across multiple jurisdictions worldwide. He remains active in academic machine learning research, including being area chair at FACTS and ethics chair of NeurIPS. Jahao also consults with nonprofits on open source development and investigative data journalism. Thanks so much for being here with us. Let's hear from you, how you stumbled on this field.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I think I've always been interested in how we could use computers to understand the world. That was why I did my PhD in computational physics. And later on, I realized that humans were interesting to study and not as terrifying as I thought they were when, I don't know, maybe famous last words, but these, I think to me, I came to the realization that that problems involving humans were actually among the most difficult and the most challenging. And I feel like there's something to be said about how can we take a more rational approach towards understanding those problems. And this realization for me personally came around the time when I left academia. So I used to be research faculty at MIT. I left in 2016 when the deep learning revolution of that time was well underway. And I thought, hey, like all of this stuff that I find interesting is not happening in universities anymore. It's in companies. Let me go figure out what that looks like in industry. And then I ended up at Capital One. And later at JP Morgan, I helped to start the AI research department there. And so like Talia, I got really interested in this lens of AI and regulation because a universal complaint when I was at these banks was, I built this model. Okay, now let me get legal's approval. And then 6 months pass, or 9 months pass, or 36 months will pass. And by the time you get the approval to deploy the model, it's already obsolete. So what on earth are we doing? How did we get here? Became a problem that initially frustrated me. And then later on, I was like, oh, there is actually a good reason here. Like Talia said, that banking has an extremely long history of algorithmic decision-making and has made a lot of mistakes that have crystallized into regulations and rules of one form or the other. And I worry that we will fail to learn from those mistakes and repeat them in the wider sphere of generative AI in the broader tech industry.
Thank you. And then last but not least, a real pleasure to welcome Julia Angwin, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, New York Times bestselling author, entrepreneur, and currently New York Times opinion writer. She was a co-founder and editor-in-chief of The Markup, a nonprofit newsroom that investigates the impact of technology on society. She was a senior reporter at ProPublica from 2014 to April 2018, and staff reporter at the New York Bureau of the Wall Street Journal from 2000 to 2013. She's the author of 2 nonfiction books, Stealing MySpace, The Battle to Control the Most Popular Website in America, and Dragnet Nation. She's a winner and 2-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Journalism. We are especially grateful to you for joining us at the last minute. Our speaker, Sigal Samuel, who was supposed to have tonight, had a family emergency, and we wish her all the very best. We're very, very glad to have you here. Any of you who've taken, any MBAs who've taken our core BA class will know that we actually studied Julia's work in that MBA class in the last lecture. So really a pleasure to have you here. And maybe I'll let you introduce yourself.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a Columbia Business School graduate. I did the Knight Badgett program. Some of you guys might know that from some of your colleagues. And then I stayed for the MBA in 2000. And I can't believe how nice your office is. This place is like we were in the bowels of Uris Hall. So wow, you guys are living the life. I'm so happy for you. I came to AI really the same way I came to everything in my life, which is I grew up in Palo Alto in the Silicon Valley, and my parents, we were like the early pioneers in what was really at that time the personal computer revolution. So computers went from like the size of a room to a size of a desk. And then my parents moved out there. They were early in the industry. And so I really learned, even though I'm quite old, I really think of myself as a digital native because I never touched a typewriter, and I started programming in 5th grade, courtesy of Steve Jobs, actually, who paid for, I think, a program in all of the Palo Alto elementary schools where we all learned programming. And so I really grew up in the industry, and I actually thought, this is so hilarious, but I really thought there were 2 industries like you could choose from in life, hardware and software. And it really didn't occur to me that there was another option until I went off to college at University of Chicago and realized there was like a whole other world out there. So I joined journalism partly to like rebel against technology. But what happened was, of course, once technology became interesting and big, I was like the only person in the newsroom who knew anything about it. So I eventually ended up becoming a technology reporter, and I've been covering the industry for decades. And recently have started writing for New York Times Opinion. And it's a real treat to be able to express my opinion after so many years of just presenting the facts, just the facts, ma'am. And so I guess I've been writing about AI, obviously, because you have to. And I would say that like I come to AI the same way I come to all the technology things, which is I'm really strangely optimistic, despite the fact that I have continuously seen this industry fail to live up to its potential, to fail to like live up to its ethical obligations. And I've documented that. And yet I still have a lot of hope for it, because I think I grew up steeped in this idea of how this technology could empower us. And so I feel the same way about AI, which is I think there's a lot of things to be hopeful about. But right at this moment, honestly, generative AI has been unleashed on us with, I think, far too little testing. And I think it's classic technology industry, which is that, back when I was growing up, my parents, like when they would work at a different software company or whatever, there was a quality assessment lab, and you would go, they would go in there and test the products before they release them because you sold them. I don't know if any of you guys remember this, but they probably don't, you're too young. But once upon a time, software was sold in boxes, and shrink wrap boxes cost about $60. It was quite expensive. And you had to really make sure it was like, didn't have any bugs in it. And so sometimes my parents would bring me in because I was a kid, because kids are really good at breaking things. So I would go and like try to break all the software. And nowadays the model is totally different, right? These companies release it to the wide public, and we're the beta testers, like we're the quality assurance lab. The public is that. And I think that just has a lot of problems, especially as the stakes keep getting higher and higher, where we keep embedding this software, which was like, it was maybe fine when you were just releasing a game or a way to be friends online. But now we're talking about using this in medical and banking and all these different contexts where I think a lot more safety testing needs to be taking place.
My dad also used to get me to. bang on the software. And I don't know.
It's fun.
Fantastic. It's great. Fantastic. Very, very excited for our discussion tonight. So I want to jump straight in and begin by saying that one of the most frustrating things for me when I think about ethics and AI is I keep on hearing whenever someone talks about ethics and AI, it's always through anecdote. Oh, we have a deep fake that was used in this way. Oh, we have someone whose credit was denied that shouldn't have been denied. I guess what I'd like to begin from each of you is to hear a little bit, how do you think about ethics and generative AI generally? What are the sort of high-level points that you try to hit? Is there sort of categories you think about? Is there a framework you use to kind of organize your thoughts around the idea of the ethics of AI? Yes, Julia, it seems. Let's go.
Sorry, this is like my absolute problem, which is I've been constantly going around yelling to everyone that I feel like we have a denominator problem, right? We have all these anecdotes floating around and we don't have a denominator. Like, first of all, how often did this, like, for instance, you read about like some reporter gets this AI to do a crazy thing. Well, how many tries did it take them, right? Like, did they sit there for 8 hours trying 20 different prompts?
Try to prod it as much as possible. And yeah.
Exactly. And like, so I am sort of obsessed with this denominator problem. And I actually was trying to hold an event called the AI denominator event, but my friends talked me out of it. So it's going to be called the AI Democracy Forum. But basically, I'm starting next year. I'll be starting at Columbia. We're going to have our first testing event where we're going to test AI and try to establish a denominator of how they perform in one specific context. So in elections, I think that it's really important to think about AI in terms of specific domains. It doesn't make any sense to talk about AI across different fields because it's totally different, the AI that runs an autonomous vehicle than the AI that you use for ChatGPT. And also ChatGPT is totally different than Google's Bard and Anthropic's Claude, and no one is doing any benchmarking of those against each other. It's not a monolith. And so I'm very obsessed with this idea that we need to establish denominators and see sort of a baseline. What do they perform like now? And then also continue to monitor it because that baseline will move. And then also we have to do it per domain. Like experts in each field need to say, is it safe? So there was a good paper recently where some doctors tested it on classic symptoms. They tested, I think it was maybe, I don't know if it was all the different chatbots or just ChatGPT, but they basically put in a list of classic symptoms and said how often were they right in the diagnosis. And the answer was 60%. Now, the reporters who wrote about it called it successful. And I was like, I don't really want a doctor who's 60% successful. But I was so pleased. I feel like we need way more of that. We need that like across every aspect of every domain. And then the problem is also almost never are you presented with classic symptoms, right? And so like you have to understand that when we're testing, you're testing at a really baseline, and then there's going to be all sorts of circumstances.
Yeah, and I guess that's my question. Yeah, but go on, Talia, sorry.
I mean, I was gonna say, yeah, I was gonna say that I'm obsessed with another dimension of this issue, and it's, you know, I totally agree. We have all these articles that are focusing on that anecdote, and they always have this flavor of, you know, if we see it, we know it when we see it, right? And that this problem is so obvious, and only any human looking at the problem would immediately see something's going wrong. And I think what that has led us to is to kind of avoid some very basic definitional issues when it comes to ethics, when it comes to fairness, when it comes to discrimination. And you can see this so obviously in regulators, that we focus on transparency, we focus on kind of explainability as if it's self-evident what the issue is going to be. And we've really avoided the difficult questions, I think, a lot because we are so exposed to this kind of anecdotal evidence of something going wrong, in which we just have this obvious example.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And, you know, speaking back on both your points, I'm curious about, you know, Julie, even you mentioned the denominator, but there's a question of what are the different worlds of problems we can face? People say hallucinations. I mean, people call everything a hallucination now. Your computer crashes, oh, well, that's a hallucination. I got, you know, so in some sense, do you think there's even a framework we have right now? And maybe Johao, you have a thought on this. Is there even a framework right now for all the different things that can go wrong? And do we have a way of thinking about those when it comes to AI going ethically off the rails?
I mean, am I allowed to use the entire hour to answer that question?
Sorry?
Can I use the entire hour to answer that question? Because maybe I'll just focus on.
I don't have control of the mic, so absolutely. I'm not going to be able to stop you.
Sure. All right. So I think one thing first of all is I think defining what is success, what is not successful is actually the most difficult problem that we have today. And it's part of this is just not agreeing on the semantics of what we're studying. And so we throw around terms like bias as if we understand what that means. And we throw around things like you know it when you see it. I'm like, when you said that, I was thinking, oh yeah, like that worked really well to define pornography, and yet content moderation, of course, is like a very, very prominent example of we don't really know what it is we need to measure, but we claim we're building AI to do it. Who actually does it in the end? We farm it out to people in third world countries, and we farm it out to prison labor, and we farm it out to all of these people who are just invisible. They're like the Uber driver of AI. Like they're there, the people sitting behind the other side, the computers, like going like, this is porn, this is not porn, this is a truck, this is a stop sign. Like people are doing that, and so much of what is AI is actually like this much larger system of data gathering and usage and presentation of those results that we don't talk about as well. And so there is almost this sort of like maladaptation that we have where like what we are calling AI is actually this like diffuse, like poorly defined blob of a system that actually encompasses all of these things. And this is the kind of thing that oftentimes I start with this when I talk to clients.
What's so interesting hearing you talk, I caught myself realizing as you were talking that implicitly almost, when I asked the question to Julia and Talia, I was thinking of, oh, when we talk about ethics in AI, well, the problems are hallucinations, the problems are we'll misdiagnose people, the problem are we won't get credit. And then you bring up the fact that even the whole training, the whole ecosystem, we need to think wider in some sense. There is the AI is not just the tool that I get when I go to chat.openai.com or whatever other tool I use. It is everything behind it, how it gets trained, how it gets sort of designed, et cetera.
Right, and so AI, when we say ethics of AI, is it the specific technical model, or is it like this wider system that you've built, which includes the apparatus of collecting data, managing data, and then like actually doing something in reaction to the outputs of the model? And we're seeing actually that divergence appear in global regulations. Where we see on one hand, like the European regulations are very clear, like we need to be context specific, we need to be systems and holistic in our assessment and not component based. And I don't see that consistently being drawn out. And I think a lot of the academic literature, honestly, has not really been able to grapple with that fact that like a lot of the academic work is very model specific. And here I mean academic and like isn't like the CS/ML literature. It's like, here's my new technique. It achieves 1% improvement over state of the art. Okay, great.
Yeah, and I think what strikes me and what you say is almost that we almost have two ends of the spectrum, right? We have one end of the spectrum, which is what you might call the European regulation or the journalists, which is sort of, we're just poking the system, seeing what happens, seeing what comes out. And then the other end of the spectrum is the academics who are taking an extreme other end of the spectrum, saying we are looking for one very specific thing. We're going to look at the denominator, we're going to look at the numerator, we're going to look at every sort of part of it. And in some sense, we need to meet in the middle in some sense, where we need to get sort of a more rigorous definition of a broader kind of phenomenon. Yeah.
But I think also, and sort of piggybacking on what Jahal was saying, that it's also important to pull back the lens a little bit further and say, so when you think about generative AI, I wrote a piece about this recently called The Tragedy of the AI Commons. Basically, this idea that what we have is training models that have been trained on scooping up just enormous amounts of content from the internet, right? And then using that to create a new product. And what we are now realizing, I think, slowly, is that is there's a possibility that that's going to hollow out all of those underlying sources. So think about Wikipedia, right? The people who write and build Wikipedia are all volunteers, and they do it to contribute to the public good. Now, every one of these AI models is built largely on Wikipedia, right? And I would say that there's a real challenge there because the Wikipedia license, the copyright license it has, Creative Commons, actually requires attribution. It's you're supposed to, that's why when you pull up the Google search results, it says Wikipedia, right? Like they don't just sort of take the information. But Wikipedia has sort of not really been able to enforce that. And these most of these models are not providing the sourcing material of where they got their information. So then fast forward a couple years, and everyone finds it super convenient to just say to their AI bot, like, tell me, you know, whatever, who is the lead actor in Friends or whatever, and then it will tell you, right? Because it pulls it from Wikipedia. So the question I have is, why would anyone continue to volunteer to support and maintain Wikipedia if it's really just the back end training database for a for-profit company, right? And so I'm extremely worried about what we call the public commons of the internet, where we actually share in good faith quality information with each other. That's not just Wikipedia. There's Stack Overflow and there's Reddit. I mean, some of it's not as good quality, but you know, there's a lot of places where people share information in good faith and devote a lot of time to it. And all of those things are being fed into these pipelines in a way that feels a lot like theft. And so I'm really worried about not just the bias and the accuracy, but actually what happens to our public internet when it's being sort of overgrazed, is the analogy that I'm.
That's a great point to bring up. And Talia, actually, I'm curious, you know, you're in the world of law. How alive are people to this issue, to the fact that there's a whole host of a thicket of intellectual property issues that are coming up? Are people sort of thinking about it? What's the latest?
Yeah, that's, I guess, is one of the major legal challenges. I mean, often in law, we kind of conflate the question of what are our laws with what ought to be our laws. And so we've got this big question that's being debated among kind of legal academics of kind of what, how would you apply current copyright law to this setting? And it's pretty complicated, right? It doesn't look like our classic copyright cases. There's quite a lot of transformation that goes on that impacts kind of whether we can consider this fair use or not. Issues of attribution, I think, are a lot more complicated than the classic domains we have in mind. And so there's I guess a lot of debate of kind of, if a court would decide some of these cases, what would they determine? And it's kind of blindsided us perhaps a little bit to the larger question of, well, what should our copyright laws be? And I think Julie's exactly right that there's this aspect here of many policy dimensions that aren't the classic domain of copyright. Thinking about what does it mean for kind of the commons of the internet to be overgrazed? What does it mean that we rely on people to produce content that they're not producing? What does it mean that people kind of don't get this actual kind of attribution? What does it mean that essentially we have this whole labor force that is uncompensated for the labor that they put in? And so I think the challenge is going to be thinking about whether kind of copyright needs to change to accommodate that, what the rules might look like, but also are there other frameworks that we should be thinking about beyond copyright that are right to address these various policy issues?
What comes to mind, I wonder, you know, if you think of the open source ecosystem for code, where a lot of the world's sort of richest companies are relying on code that is written by volunteers, contributed by volunteers, do you think there's a world in which something like that might form part of a solution to that problem, where in some sense there is some motivation that's created to contribute to these sort of open source tools, and in some ways the companies contribute back to those open source tools in some way, and it's unclear what that would be yet, but do you think that's the direction we might end up going?
I can comment on this. So when I was at MIT, one of my main positions was working on open source projects full time, and it's I worked on a programming language called Julia, which I'm not sure how familiar it is to this audience.
Julia.
Yeah, that one. I gave Julia a Julia sticker, and she was like, "What is this?" I think the part about open source, like people obviously talk about open source now as like, hey, like this is an alternative to like proprietary. Everything is locked behind the locked doors of tech companies. The reality is that you still need to pay people somehow. Very few people are in the position of privilege to be able to contribute to open source without pay for an extended period of time. And so what you actually get to work with is oftentimes like enthusiastic students or people who kind of jump in for a few weeks, a few months, and you got to train them to get them up to speed. By the time they're ready to contribute, they do one or two things, and then they're like, okay, well, I've moved on to something else. And we just accept that as a fact of life in open source. And if we look at the structure of how major open source packages are done, like, you know, let me just give one example in machine learning, which is PyTorch. Everyone almost everyone uses PyTorch these days. And
Social library to train neural networks and these
yes,
deep learning
yeah.
models.
So and it's open source, but the reality is that like many of these contributors are paid at large tech companies to invest in that project because it's in their mutual collective interest to do so. So to the point of like, let's build something for the greater good. Like there are actually companies who recognize that and like go on. Like there's like also like the Mozilla Foundation where hey, like there's a philanthropic aspect to it. But the whole point is we need, if you get what you pay for.
Yeah.
And so
I think perhaps one thing that is very different is to contribute to an open source product, you need a computer and a desk chair.
Yes.
To contribute to these sort of deep learning generative AI models, you need a massive cluster that costs God knows how much money and so on and so forth. So that certainly sort of, adds a difference.
Yeah, so the resource inequity, I think, is sort of the new twist that AI brings to the table, which is again due to the volume of data, the ingestion, and again, it speaks once again to like this is a systemic thing. It's not just the code. I get this all the time with clients where they're like, "Can you just audit my AI?"
Right.
I'm like, "Here's the code." And I'm like, "Sorry, like that's not actually the best starting point for this discussion. Let's talk about your data." And we're like, "Oh, we need to like figure out what data we're using." It's very often the next question. I'm like, okay, great. Like, why don't we start from there? And like, I'm going to have to charge you from that.
Let's shift a little bit. I want to, the intellectual property is clearly a big part of, the ethics involved in sort of AI, generative AI. Let's talk about a little bit about the kind of content that AI can produce that sometimes seems unethical, whether it's racist, whether it's misogynist, whether it's sort of deep fakes. I often wonder whether, let me flip that question. Part of the reason it produces content that we might consider problematic is because it's been trained on data that exists out there in the world. There are problems out there in the world, and so the AI is going to reproduce those problems. Do you think that's the main issue? Or do you think that's almost missing maybe some other sort of factors that go on in terms of making these models, produce these undesirable results?
I just went, so someone else can go first.
I'm happy to go. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw recently last week, there was somebody tweeting about if you ask ChatGPT, do Israelis deserve freedom? And it said 100%, like all humans deserve freedom. And then it said, if you ask, do Palestinians deserve freedom? And it said, that's a complicated question with a lot of like nuance and can't answer it. And so there are definitely just bias, right? That's a biased response. Like it should just say everyone deserves freedom, I think, if all humans deserve freedom. And I think, yes, you can say that maybe that's the training data. Maybe that's some guardrails that they put in. Like the problem is we don't know. We don't know what the companies injected.
And that's going to be one of the massive problems, right? Of figuring out. I mean, they're not public. They're not open about what they are doing to stop the models.
Like the thing I feel like so strongly about is like I just want footnotes. Like where did you get the where is this from? You know, and they're not telling us. And I think it's because they don't want to take liability for like this is the decision they made versus the one that was scooped up. But you're the liability expert.
I mean, obviously, an additional challenge is that the success of so many of these systems is, did I get the content I want? And when that's your criteria, right? It's not the truth. It's not something unbiased. It's what did I manage to give the answer that I want? And I think it's kind of I might be jumping forward, but on Monday this week there was an executive order from the Biden administration on kind of generative AI. And one of the really interesting things it talks about there is that AI systems shouldn't exacerbate discrimination, right? It's as if they're accepting that it's going to reflect some discrimination. They just don't want to kind of make it worse to some extent. And to me, that was an interesting, perhaps kind of concession in a way to what we can and can't achieve through some of these systems.
Is there a world I've ever seen, and I know this kind of touches a little bit on your work, Julia, but is there a sense in which I've often wondered whether AI can in some sense have a counterintuitively positive effect on some of these inequalities, in the sense that once we see what the AI produces and it's incontrovertibly unethical or incontrovertibly biased, it almost forces us to wake up to the fact that these inequalities exist. I know you've done work in the criminal justice system. Has that happened at all, or is it, no, am I being too hopeful?
I mean, I have devoted my life to this premise, right? Like I am constantly trying to investigate and bring facts to light in the hopes that they will be solved, right? And so, most famously, we were just talking about this before, is I did this big investigation in 2016 about these algorithms that are used in the criminal legal system throughout the United States, and showed through analyzing the data that they were biased against Black defendants. And it was an incredibly clear statistical finding. And we are, 8 years in, and this algorithm and some ones like it are still being used throughout the country, right? And so I really had thought that bringing this to light would cause some change. It did cause all sorts of other interesting things. So in the computer science field, it's led to lots of analysis about how we can build fairer algorithms. And so it wasn't meaningless, but it's often true, I've found as a journalist, that like you do all this work, you bring these facts to light, and then it's like very disappointing. But I still think we're better off for knowing, right? Like, and so this is sort of the optimism that keeps me going as a journalist, is that at least now people who use it have to like wrestle with their own soul that they decided to do that. And I think that's still an advantage. And I still also believe in the long run that something will change, although I realize I'm holding on to a very thin strand of hope there.
Yeah, so I want to comment, like, from a technical and modeling perspective. Like, I think one of the biggest challenges here is failing to recognize retrospective bias in data.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, like, when you go to a financial advisor and you want to invest in something, they always give you a disclaimer like past performance is not indicative of future performance. They put this on every prospectus, at least if they're ethical and compliant. And yet in data science, we should be sending the same warning label. Like, the data you collected is by definition retrospective. It's in the past. This is what happened before. These were the people you used to give mortgages to. Maybe and when you build a model to predict the credit risk score, you're basically saying, I want to reproduce the patterns that I see in my data, but the data reflects the past. And yet somehow we're using that to predict future behavior. And so understanding that that is the assumption that you make, I think, is perhaps one of the most insidious assumptions that oftentimes doesn't get talked about, which is the fact that you're basically assuming the future universe to look like the past universe. Therefore, the past data you have is accurate and model. And
the past universe is not perfect, and so you're going to reproduce in some sense.
Yeah. And am I allowed to poll the audience on a question?
Please.
Okay, I would love the audience to give your best guess of in what year were women allowed to own a bank account in this country?
You're gonna have to.
Oh, you know the answer. Okay, well.
Give them some options, or you want to just get people to.
Okay, so can I have show of hands? So who thinks it's in the 19th century? Who thinks it is before World War II? Okay, a few hands. How many people think it was 1960? How many people think it was 1970?
Really?
Yeah, okay, so the correct answer, so for any of you who haven't raised your hands yet, so the answer was 1974.
Wow.
And just think about that. Like, I think people oftentimes don't realize that it was that recent in history that if you were a woman, you were born with the wrong parts to own a bank account, unless your father or your husband said it was okay to do so. And that data is still what we're using to.
It's still being used to train models.
Yeah, and so I'm not saying like data from 1970s are still being used, but like that historical echo of the past is still in our data.
I'm actually curious to ask you as well, Joe. The model you mentioned, right, determining credit, I mean, you could use generative AI to do something like this, but those kinds of models have existed for ever and ever, not generative AI, basic AI. Do you think in some sense that I've sometimes wondered whether we're worrying about hallucinations when really what we should be worrying about is how we're using models to give people credit and put people in jail? To what extent do you think generative AI is actually what we should be worrying about versus we should really be worrying about vanilla AI or the sort of standard old AI?
So maybe let's kind of unpack the semantic issue here, which is that generative AI is not a kind of AI, it's a way to use AI. And like almost every AI system can be either discriminative or generative. And so discriminative is, this is a cat, this is a dog. And generative is make me a cat photo. Like the underlying model of the universe that you learn in the AI system is the same, with a few exceptions. There are some older methods that don't lend themselves to generative, but you're effectively taking the model and you're saying, I'm learning the joint distribution of this word cat with these pictures. That's the thing that you're actually doing when you're training. But then what you do with that is the difference between discrimination and generation, which is, do I feed it a photo and
Right.
say like, okay, what's on this side?
Or do I ask it to create sort of a material?
Yeah.
And so do you think one or the other certainly has more potential to create ethical issues, or you think it's
There's definitely a definitional issue that is more difficult with generative AI, and it really comes down to what is a correct cat photo for you? Like, what does that even mean? And so that's actually much more difficult, not intrinsically because it was generated, but because the type of output you're now asking AI to produce, which you now want to validate and check, is much more complicated.
Right.
You know, it used to be, I'm just looking at numbers, I'm just looking at the output of a regression model, I'm just looking at yes or no labels. Now I have to think about like, is this voice call like spam? Like, you know, like it's a very different kind of thing to say like, make me a spammy or a non-spammy.
That makes sense.
Call.
That's more
if you run it the other
difficult
way, it's just like intrinsically more complex.
Makes sense. Talia, I'm curious to ask you about accountability. You know, we touched on it a little bit earlier. We've been talking about this for a few years for self-driving cars, let's say, and somehow in generative AI, no one's as for understandable reasons won't run you over yet.
Yeah.
Again, you know, what's the thinking generally right now? And are we using our current laws? Are we trying to redesign new laws? How are we thinking about it?
Yeah, you know, I think in a lot of domains, and this is classic of self-driving cars, the approach to kind of the law steps in when something goes wrong, right? It's very kind of ex post, and we dealt with this kind of primarily through tort law and other laws that kind of deal when kind of something essentially goes wrong. And I think one of the big changes, and for us, this is natural because this is how financial regulation works. But I think the change now is to not kind of wait for things to blow up and then think about how our legal system, how maybe our court system might deal with it, but think kind of ex ante. What are the systems that we need to set up? What's the kind of auditing and oversight that you would need kind of at the back end or kind of at the first stage? And it's quite apparent when you look at attempts worldwide now to think about how should we be regulating AI, including generative AI. And so perhaps just to give two examples, so the EU actually circulated a proposal for the regulation of AI in 2021. So this was before anyone was really focusing on generative AI. And the idea was to kind of provide this overarching framework for AI across all domains, kind of like the GDPR that deals with privacy in Europe, the same kind of idea that it's just this big regulation that applies across all domains. And it has had to deal with, I guess, in recent months, this question of kind of how do we bring in the generative AI piece, but it's very much focused on this idea of kind of what are the systems that we set up ex ante rather than kind of just ex post. When we look, another example is what I mentioned. Well, the US, there's been quite a bit around regulation of AI, but most importantly, Monday this week, we had the kind of Biden administration executive order, 100 pages long on focused on kind of providing guidance to agencies.
Give it to ChatGPT, it'll summarize it for you. Right?
Yeah, you joke, but there are sections that definitely went into ChatGPT as I was reading it. Yes, it's very long and in legalese, but it's a very different way. So it kind of shares some of the elements of the European regulation of thinking about how do we look at these system ex ante, but it's very different in the sense that it's very much directing agencies in particular domains to think about their particular issues. So we can think of Europe as kind of trying to tackle this issue of thinking, well, how should we regulate AI regardless of domain to some extent? Whereas the US approach, to the extent that they'll actually follow up on regulation, will be one that's much more focused on kind of, well, how does the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau deal with AI? How does the Federal Trade Commission deal with AI? How does the Environmental Protection Agency deal with AI, and so on?
That makes sense.
So I think this, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say there's something here that is worth emphasizing about the difference between sector-specific and omnibus comprehensive. And so the European approach is like, I think, the most well-known example of like an omnibus approach. And the US approach has been much more like sector-specific.
Okay.
The other thing I want to point out very quickly is that there's lots of stuff going on outside of the US and Europe as well that I think like doesn't get enough attention in the world of AI regulation. And like the thing that everyone loves to like cast as like the bad guy right now, China, is actually perhaps the most progressive in regulating generative AI right now.
Fascinating. Like
And,
how, do you have some examples?
They have actually published testing standards for generative AI that they want companies to adhere to. And it's like, it's a draft, but for my understanding of Chinese law, I'm not by any means an expert. Like a draft is like 95% there. So like basically it's gonna look like this. You might quibble about the numbers, but it does say things like, you need to test at least 1,000 examples of this, 1,000 examples of that,
Wow.
and so on and so forth. Like this is way more prescriptive and detailed than anything I've ever seen in any other country. So I think it's worth mentioning that like this is not this is not just like a sort of Western world issue.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's
That
worth,
wasn't your point, but like
no. And it's. I mean, it's worth mentioning that this is not just a China AI approach. I mean, in general, when it comes to regulating technology, we see a lot coming kind of out of China. It's kind of much more.
Right, and then it's the lesser powers approach, which is like trying to reconcile and harmonize. So that's yet another thing that's happening right now. I'll stop because I know Julia has some
thoughts. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I just can't help it, but I just want to say, just to be very clear, there is actually no attempt to regulate AI in this country. And if anyone was misunderstanding the executive order, that is just a like thoughts and feelings situation. Okay, so I'm sorry, but that's true, right? So it's like, it's a bunch of like guidance and like, wouldn't it be nice if, and like, wouldn't they, la la la, but they know. And Chuck Schumer has said there's no AI bills passing. So like,
I'm curious, do you think it would be better to take a more sort of prescriptive approach in some sense? I would imagine part of the reason we have the thoughts and feelings approach is because it's hard and we don't know what the right thing is, but you think it might make sense to?
Well, I mean, I think like you were talking about autonomous vehicles. That's such a good example. Autonomous vehicles, we don't have any safety testing standards before they put them on the road. We literally just trust the companies to basically buy. We basically have standards, which is so crazy to me. They must buy a lot of insurance. That's what you have to do to get on the road, okay? Because that way we know you're on the hook if anything bad happens. And it's wild, right? Like, you know, San Francisco just had to pull, like, all of the cruise cars have been pulled off the road because the cars are, they do weird things. Like they basically stop all the time because they're cautious, which is great. It sounds good in theory, but actually it's not good in theory. So they stop in times when people don't expect them to stop. So there's constant rear ending. And then of course, this horrible situation where recently a woman was crossing the street and a human driver hit her. She fell down. Then the autonomous vehicle ran over her and then stopped because it was like confused. And then it was like, oh, I better pull over. Dragged her 20 feet and then stayed on top of her until the firefighters could lift the vehicle up off of her. Okay, so these are the kinds of mistakes that autonomous vehicles make. And they're just different kinds of mistakes than human drivers make. And so, but of course, the reason they were pulled off the road was not because of this incident. It was because the company, Cruise, hid the footage from the DMV. So the cars have cameras everywhere. And so they knew that it had pulled over, but they didn't share the footage with DMV, which their only requirement actually is to report accidents to the DMV. That's like all you need is insurance and report accidents. And they didn't do the second. So,
are we sure you did the first?
What?
Are you sure they have insurance?
We don't know. Let's check. But my point is we have no standards, right? And I think you can go and say, oh, it's too hard. Is it too hard? You know, when I had to get a driver's license, I had to take a vision test, I had to take a driving test and a written test.
But to be fair,
can't vehicles take a test?
But was that the case when we began driving at the very dawn of sort of, you know, the car? I don't know if we had to take tests, if we had to take vision tests.
So how many people do you want to have killed before we start having testing? Like, that's my question, right?
I mean, I think the challenge in many domains, and again, you know, I'm thinking very much of kind of consumer finance that has a, an existing regulatory structure. The problem is not only, the lack of regulation of many of the domains, is are we getting the regulation right when we are proposing regulations? I mean, it's very curious. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, in charge of kind of regulating anything to do with household finance, they talk about AI all the time. And they kind of remind us all the time that even consumer credit providers and lenders who use AI, still they have to comply with existing laws. We're told that again and again and again, but they're very concrete issues around kind of the definitions of what would compliance look like, that they're refusing to provide actual concrete evidence on. And you see this in a very different way, but when you look at the EU regulation, one of the things that's so curious, and I think is becoming kind of more should give us pause when we think about generative AI, is that so much of the EU regulation is around this idea that what we need is a human in the loop, right? That things go wrong when we have automated systems, but if we have a human, I mean, what I imagine is that the EU is thinking that, like, I don't know, humans seeing these like 0 1s, and they're kind of picking up on when things go wrong. If we have that going on, then we solve a lot of our issues. And I just think that that's not true. I think it's optimistic thinking. I mean, to go back to a domain that you've written about a lot, we know that people can sometimes work really hard on having algorithms that have certain properties, but then, when judges make decisions, then it's, manifesting itself in a slightly different way. And none of the ways in which we're thinking about auditing algorithms or building algorithms take into account that there is a human user at the end. And so if we want to say, well, what is the impact of kind of moving to this world where we have decision-making that's informed from AI, what we really should be testing and looking at is the ultimate decisions by the end users. And yet we still kind of treat algorithms in so many of these domains as if it's a thing in isolation without an end user.
Right, which is where the systemic thing is so,
yeah,
the systemic approach is so important because of that. And because it could be the exact same AI system, but how you use it may change your risk calculus.
Yeah.
Right. So
we have to hand over to the audience in a few minutes. I just want one last question, if I may, from each one of you. We're speaking to a room of future business leaders. Each of you, what is one step you'd recommend to them for cultivating a culture of AI and ethics within their teams? They're going to go into a workplace that's, one thing I can tell you is that when you get to work, it's going to be more AI based than it is now. It just keeps on increasing. What's one tip you might give them to create a more ethical environment in the way they use AI? Who wants to go first? I can pick otherwise.
I can go first
if
no one else wants to. I would say ethics is about people, and people don't always agree. And your ethical calculus has to be able to reason about that. I think all too often I see very one-dimensional and unipolar aspects to ethics, where like, that's bad, don't do that. And I'm like, well, okay, so you're telling me that my business shouldn't exist, is what you're telling me as an ethics person. Well, so that's the kind of tension that you're going to see all the time. Like, business wants to do something, there will be some ethical dimension that may be problematic for a legal perspective, or like sort of like public trust perspective. And it's really a balancing act of them, rather than like an absolutist, like you cannot do this approach that's actually going to move the needle in industry.
Embrace complexity, is that fair?
Yes.
Right. Julia? I'll pick Julia.
I mean, I guess I'm just, I would always say be really skeptical. Like, the incidental effects are always so hard to see when you're the one implementing it. So unless you are talking to the people who are affected, and so actually speaking to the people who are affected by these things is the only way you're going to really get the ground truth, because it's not going to look the same from the vantage point you're at.
I think that's a great point. I wish we'd had more time to discuss it, but the kinds of people who are designing these systems are by definition, they're very technical. They're not necessarily representative of everyone in the world. And so I love that idea of making sure that you that you include the perspective of the people who are going to be impacted and sort of by these models. Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of that. I think that we probably need to move away from this way of thinking about kind of fairness, discrimination, and ethics as kind of a binary: do I pass, do I not pass? And thinking much more closely about well, what is the harm, what is the benefit, and how do we think through that kind of trade-off. And I think that is looking at it in a complex way. It's thinking about people who, for example, do fair lending or the legal team, not as just kind of a sign-off at the end of the process, but kind of be involved in the actual development and thinking through the various issues at the various stages of kind of the system.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Let's hand over to our audience for some questions. I think we have some mics going around. Let's start over here, and then maybe Tracy, you can give the mic at the back. Wonderful.
Hello. Hello.
Hey.
Thank you so much for being here and for speaking today. My name's Zach. I'm a photographer. And when I'm out on an assignment, maybe I'm shooting a wedding or something, and I go home and I'm editing my pictures, and I'm using the clone stamp tool to remove somebody from the background, like that's well accepted. People don't really bat an eye at that, even when they get their photos in the end. But now I can, instead of spending 20 minutes on a picture, I can use Photoshop's generative fill to remove the person from the background. Do I have an ethical obligation to disclose that I've used generative AI to modify a wedding photo or a piece for my portfolio?
Let's maybe expand that a little more broadly. What is the, what is the ethical responsibility we have to actually distinguish work that is ours versus work that sort of generative AI helps with? Talia, it looks like you had.
I was going to say, maybe I think this is a good example of like context matters in the calculus, right? It's very different when you say like the client probably would want this, and I'm exercising my best judgment for the client. But if this was then a photo that was like a celebrity wedding, and you're like editing the facts out, then like maybe there are some issues there if you were going to use this in like a news piece, right? And so it's the exact same photo, exact same use case, but like your intended use does actually factor in. So that I think that's part of that discussion, and that's why ethics oftentimes comes down to it depends. And one thing I'll maybe as an anecdote, since we have Talia here, I'm like, I think the first thing I did when I got interested in the fair lending problem, I was like, I want to study AI ethics. I'm like, oh, we have like legal counsel in-house at these banks. And I was like, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And the answer was, it depends, it depends, it depends. And I'm like, don't tell me it depends. I just want to know what you think about. But then the thing that like my light bulb moment was like, we just reason about the world in different ways. And it's just like, what if this was the situation? And then immediately they were like, well, this will apply, that will apply. So it's not that lawyers don't have theories. It's just that like, you know, you can reason about them very differently contextually. Whereas AI, like technical people, we like to start with the abstract theory and then try to figure out what works in this situation. So I think ethics oftentimes means like we have to challenge the way we think about the relationship between abstract principles and concrete reality.
Yeah, I guess, so I teach contract law to the first year law students. And so I think of a question from this lens of, well, what do people expect to know? You know, there's this academic literature called algorithmic aversion that's really trying to figure out, like, when are people averse to algorithms? When do they like algorithms? And I think related to that is this question is, when do people want to know that there's an algorithm involved? And I think it's important to recognize that that is something that evolves people's expectations. And so I think your example is great, because I think kind of in the first example, we feel like, well, I don't need to know that. And maybe in the second example, maybe I do need to know that. But maybe in a few years from now, we won't feel that way at all. And it's interesting because, again, going back to the EU regulation, sorry, my examples are all kind of EU and the US, but the EU regulation is very obsessed with this idea that if you use a chatbot, you should let people know. You cannot use it without people knowing. And that's kind of freezing something very specific in time. I mean, maybe now when, you know, we're engaging with some chatbot on some website, it's really important for us to know whether it's a human or an algorithm. But in some point in the future, we'll look at it very differently. So I think of your question, at least some dimension of it, to be very much a question of expectations, recognizing that those expectations will change.
I think it's a great also question to ask, and the point of expectations. If you rewind 20 years ago, the question, 10 years ago, the question might have been, do I need to disclose that I'm using a computer, period? Do I need to disclose that I'm using Photoshop? Do I need to disclose that I'm using AI? You certainly, you know, echo the idea that you need to sort of consider the context. Other questions? Maybe we can get the microphone to Sion here, and then yes, at the back.
Hi, my name is Emmanuel Effie, and I'm an EMBA student here. My question is connecting to the biases in data, combined with the people behind the AI is not always fully representative, coupled with the fact that when you're in a company, you're creating some form of AI, there's a need a particular outcome, as you mentioned, maybe solving for a particular thing. and you have a P&L, it has to be cost effective. The question is, in keeping those in mind, what is the best way can companies account for the fact that people creating it is not fully representative of the different kind of perspective, and the system is kind of built in with a bias? When I say what's the most effective way, companies often go look at P&L to a degree. So what is, from your perspective, is a good way companies that do want to do the right thing can actually do it, because at the end of the day, bottom line, shareholders?
Thank you so much. I'm going to be interested to hear what Joao has to say. But before then, Julia, have you seen anyone do this right in your reporting? Meaning, we're very sort of familiar with your work about how wrong it went. Was there any sort of perhaps bright lights of examples where perhaps things went well? No? Oh, dear.
That's not interesting
glad.
journalism.
I know, right?
Let me report on something that went well.
I wish I could think of one, but I would say that I think that in general, the best faith actors I've seen have been the ones who do try to involve the community that they're serving. So if it's your clients in a business, or if it's community you're serving, you just that I think is the best practice. But I think, how you spend more time advising companies. So.
Yeah, you probably spend all day answering exactly that question.
So I think the first thing, one of the first discussions in this realm is oftentimes challenging the presumption that ethics is going to cost you business. And like oftentimes it's sort of like this intrinsic game where like I need to be more fair, I'm going to have to give up something to be fair. And sometimes it's not about that. Sometimes it's about fairness means like removing bias or the stereotyping in the way you frame the problem that could actually result in like a Pareto better outcome than what you started with. And sometimes it's like, and just to give like us an example, like, when we say things like, do we need to remove, like, do we need to like sacrifice some sort of accuracy in credit scoring so that we can be unbiased, whatever that means in this jurisdiction or this market? Maybe you're just maybe you're defining your market too narrowly. Because when we think about credit cards, like, like they tend to be very specific market segments. You say like, I want this customer, this fits this profile. And we see examples of this because we have Delta Airlines miles, we have like Amazon, we have Disney. And so like, the person who will get a Disney credit card is not going to be the same kind of profile that would get a Delta Airlines premium credit card, for example. But sometimes it's about them being creative about who are you targeting and who are you missing. And sometimes realizing who you're missing is where you're going to get that extra revenue. And it also could make you less biased.
Wonderful. We have questions here. Any other questions? Let's raise hands so we can get you a mic. Perfect.
Hello. All right. Hi there. I'm Seon. I'm one of the students in the MBA XMS cohort here. And first, thank you so much. This has been such an interesting discussion to watch. And I think like I just have two questions. And one of them first is going off of one of the first examples Julia brought up on the like how doctors, after using chatbots, realized there was like a 60% right out of like the entire times in terms of diagnosis. And my first question goes off of like how do you guys think of establishing these thresholds? Because when you mentioned 60%, the first thought that came into my mind was like how in Brazil, for a specific diagnosis in specific regions, their accuracy rate is even under 60% for actual human doctors. Like, how do you guys, what is the framework on trying to establish these thresholds? And even going beyond that, how can you even think about changing the metrics, given that the mistakes that the AIs do will be different ultimately from the mistakes that humans do, like such as the automotive example that you brought? And then my second question is more going to later in the discussion when we were talking about the teams that are behind building those models, how they are usually very technical, and we know that that is usually associated with a specific demographic, etc. And we all are very aware of how there's no representation of race, gender, sexuality in the people that are building those models. But also, I'm curious about like what is the skill set that you guys think we are missing in those teams? Like what other roles should we have in AI building teams? Like, should we have a philosopher? Should we have an academic person? Like, how can we make sure that these teams are thinking about the problems that we need to think?
Thanks so much. So to separate the questions, first one was how we set thresholds in sort of AI. Second one was what kind of skill sets are missing in terms of taking a team that's perhaps not as diverse as we want it to be. What skill set do we need to help represent sort of more diversity?
Well, I can take thresholds.
Please.
So right now, the way, at least in generative AI, there's a benchmarking system that's kind of evolved, right? Where there are different people come up with a bunch of tests that they run these different chatbots against and score them. And the problem is you can really only do this type of threshold and benchmarking and scoring with like really clear answers, right? So the problem is these benchmarks are very much about things like questions that are very clear, like, is this a cute dog? Yes, it's a cute dog, right? So like the benchmark is clear. And so I think there needs to be a lot more testing on nuanced things, because the types of questions people ask to these bots are not actually usually that. They're much more nuanced. And so I think some people have described this to me as like there's a bit of a crisis in AI testing, because there's not a sense right now of like, how do we do that more qualitative testing? That's why I'm actually holding an event in January to try to see if I can build a model around that. And there are lots of other great efforts going on as well in that area. And I hope that we'll find new ways to do what is like what I call more like evaluation than benchmarking, because it has to be more fuzzy. So I think it's a really important question, and I think it's one that isn't answered, but it is really important, and it's just as important for autonomous vehicles and every other type of AI too, right? Because like you wouldn't have envisioned probably this hard-breaking problem that has emerged with these vehicles, and so it would be hard to write into law. As much as I'm demanding pre-deployment testing, it's actually also really hard to know what those tests should be until you have done some exploration.
I have thoughts on this.
On the threshold.
Yeah. So I think the real question here is oftentimes some version of what's my baseline, but what is my threshold I'm comparing against, and oftentimes the baseline is not very well defined, and there's this almost like sort of cyclical business motivation where like the humans are not doing this very well. Maybe the AI can do it better because it's more objective. And what do you train the AI on? Well, you train it on the past examples which were produced by these situations that you don't have clarity on. So sometimes it's, do you do an accurate diagnosis? And sometimes like that's controversial, even to the experts. And oftentimes that's that kind of thing where like people are not clearly reasoning about the degree of expertise you need to assess the label of the outcome. And the fact that even with expertise, you may not agree. And oftentimes we kind of gloss over that in the construction of AI. But like, then what do? You're basically optimizing for like the expected average best outcome. But the laws of averages don't always give you the correct answer, right? Like, so there's a very famous US Air Force study of like, let's design the cockpit for the average pilot, and then nobody could fit in the cockpit because everyone was just slightly too big in this direction, too small in that direction. So like there's a lot of this like assumption that like regression to the mean means that like the average answer is the best answer. That is actually part of the underlying challenge. And sometimes there are problems where you have to like kind of disentangle that at that level and realize that like there are multiple valid answers to this question. And by averaging over, then you lose that nuance.
I want to try and get to one last question, but any burning thoughts on the idea of how we, ideally our team would be diverse. If we live in a world where our team isn't diverse, what kind of skill sets can help us sort of capture more of the perspective of people who the models are being applied to?
Well, I mean, I love your idea of skepticism. I mean, who are the most skeptical people? The philosophers, the economists? I don't know, but I love the idea of
journalists. You should put journalists on all the teams.
Yes.
Do we have one last question? I think we have time for that. Yes, over there.
I just want to say while you're walking that over there, I do think one problem with AI is the name. I know, I'm serious. Like if it was just called plausible explanations or things that sound good, or like a bot that writes limericks, like we wouldn't be having this.
Julie, have you ever tried to talk to investors? I'm just curious.
Yeah. I have this new startup for plausible explanations.
That's what we were talking about in the room beforehand, how it used to be big data, then it became machine learning, now it's AI, then it's generative AI. So there is an extent to which I think you're right.
Yes, like AI, they overhyped it.
Yeah. Please.
Hi, thanks for being here. There are some companies that are trying to solve, like, they're trying to present perhaps themselves as more ethical or more, better than other AI companies by virtue of how they're doing their testing or how they are developing the AI. There's like the concept of constitutional AI, which like a company like Anthropic is using, perhaps based on like the movie I, Robot, like the 3 laws don't harm
Don't mind, let me
humans, et
rush you
cetera.
to a question just for the sake of time.
Yes. So what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on constitutional AI? Is it like the silver bullet, or is it part of the solution of making AI more ethical?
We could have just started the panel with this question. Is it
Do
okay
it.
if I go first?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's your domain.
Evaluation is the most difficult thing, honestly. And like, on what basis do we think that doing essentially Q&A based interrogation of an AI system is actually a valid way to evaluate what it's thinking? I think so often in generative AI with large language models, where I always feel like, are we actually testing this thing, or are we basically repeating this to a very intelligent parrot who can say all the answers I want? Like, I have a service dog, and I've trained this dog, and like, how do I know like the internal mental state of my dog is like he's actually paying attention to me, or like maybe he's like really hungry and he's really bored with this panel right now. I don't know, but like functionally, like, does he help me with my issues? Yes, and so that's good enough. The question is, like, I think in that discussion of like constitutional AI, like, do we believe that actually telling the AI like, do no harm, like be helpful, be harmless, like, how is that actually guaranteeing anything? And so fundamentally, it's back down to the semantics of defining what is an acceptable output of that to this question. To the previous point of like what skills are missing, that answer is obviously not binary. I advocate for thinking about this not as a binary yes/no evaluation, but more like a educational outcomes testing thing, where like, how do you know the students learn enough to pass the course? And especially when the method is not exams, it's essays. What is an A grade essay? What is the B grade essay? What is the rubric that lets you distinguish between those two? We should be doing that, and we're not doing that.
Thank you.
Can I add one final point? I think it's important to think about all of those things, the constitutions and the open source models and this and that, as marketing. And I'm sorry, I'm just, I'm here to be the truth teller.
Love it.
And I think that you have to just like, they're all for-profit companies, right? Every one of them, Hugging Face, open source models, blah, blah, for-profit company, right? Venture-backed, all of them. And so they're looking for large-scale returns, and that is totally fine. That's what business is for. But I think if we're really going to talk about what does AI look like for the public benefit, I think it has to have a different business model. And I also think, like, if we really think this technology is so important, I think that we should have like the Defense Department investing or DARPA or somebody building one for the public benefit, right? So I guess I just want to open up that space for like, there could be, that would be the model, like where it's being optimized for the public benefit and not for profit.
Wonderful. Any last thoughts, Talia, before I thank everyone?
Love the skepticism.
Bye, fantastic. I cannot thank you all enough for joining us. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.